But one of the big questions that has been hanging everything in the balance ever since Saturday, and there's been a development here as well, I would suggest, when it comes to what's going on internationally, is Sir Keir Starmer came out and said, and I'm going to say, I'll say it through gritted teeth because I'm fed up of hearing these two words, but actually in saying it through gritted teeth, I strangely sound like Sir Keir Starmer. International law. He's turned around and said, well, you know, international law might preclude us from doing this. He's been going to great pains to say to Muslims gathering to celebrate the end of Ramadan in Westminster Hall yesterday, we are not part of this. We didn't do this. Now, interestingly, over the course of the weekend, it appeared when Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, was asked about whether he supported the offensive action by Donald Trump, the answer was yes. He seems to have now taken a plane down to Australia, hanging out with Albanese, those three. Carney, Albanese and Starmer often doing things in lockstep. Oh, look, you can put kids in bikinis on blocks, so we must ban X. They do seem to sort of triangulate between the three when they want to make some sort of move. But Mark Carney's now questioning whether what America and Israel have done is viable under international law. I would suggest it probably is. I think Philip thinks it probably is. But the person who's been the greatest inspiration to my way of thinking is the Shadow Attorney General, Lord Wolfson, because he put out a brilliant detailed post on X explaining his thinking. So we have him on the programme to do it for us today. Lord Wolfson, thank you so much for joining us. What do you make of this sort of... First of all, why would anybody, when it's very clear that Iran is an extremely dangerous, theocratic regime, want to start muddying the waters by banging on about international law? And also, why do you think that when it comes to international law, what America and Israel have done is perfectly acceptable?
Well, thank you for having me on. I think there were two questions, really. Your first question is, international law seemed to come into play for most people when people, in particular states such as America and Israel, attacked Iran. We didn't hear much about international law when Iran was killing tens of thousands of its own protesters. So people do seem to have a selective interest in international law. But international law is important. Don't get me wrong. I think international law is important. As a country, we ought to abide by it. The real question is, what does international law require of states? And I set out in my tweet a justification for the initial action which America and Israel took. But the truth is that matters have moved on significantly, because since then we have had a direct attack on a British sovereign base in Cyprus. Now, it seems to me that there can be no question but that we can respond forcefully to an attack on our own sovereign base. So we can have an interesting discussion about the legality of the original action by the United States and Israel. I've set out my position in some detail. But as we sit here today, there can be no question that we should be taking a muscular response to an attack on our sovereign base. And the problem I have now with the UK government position is this. The government position is that in respect of missiles which are targeted at our sovereign base in Cyprus, we will take defensive measures to take out those missiles. But what we won't do is attack to take out the missile launchers. But what we will do is allow the Americans to use our bases elsewhere to attack to take out the missile launchers, but not to take out the regime leaders who give the instructions to fire the missiles. Now, it seems to me that a good rule of thumb for any legal analysis is that if it leaves you with a result which is internally inconsistent and strategically naive, there are two options. One, international law has gone significantly awry, which is a possibility, or two, your legal analysis is wrong. And that's why I've suggested that the government's legal analysis is wrong, because it leaves us essentially relying on other states to defend our sovereign bases. And that is a ridiculous position for us to be in.
Talk to me about the role of Attorney General as Shadow Attorney General, because there's sort of two ways of looking at this in some respects. It's a bit like the Copernican revolution. Is the Attorney General there when a Prime Minister says, I want to do this? how, make this make sense legally, to then say to the Prime Minister, OK, that's what you want to do. This is legally how we prop it up, or this is where the dark areas will be. Or is it that the Attorney General says to the Prime Minister, this is what you're legally allowed to do, so now go and make your decision? A nuance there. But my concern is, I'm under the impression, I could be wrong, I'm not sitting in those meeting rooms, and I've certainly never been down to the pub with Starmer and Hermer, but I'm persistently under the impression that Hermer seems to be the one in control here. How does that role work as Shadow Attorney General or Attorney General?
Well, I think it works in the way you want it to work. In other words, the fundamental rule is that the Attorney General is there to make sure everything the government does is lawful. I think the way it ought to work, if I can use the analogy, for example, imagine a cricket ground. You're there to sort of show how big the ground is, how big the playing area is. Where the politicians want to play the game within that area of lawfulness is frankly a political decision. You're there to set the boundary rope, to say you can't go beyond the boundary because that is unlawful. What you're not there to do is to say you must play here or you must play there. The truth is, in all of these areas, there is an overlap of law and politics. And that is embodied in the position and role of the Attorney General, who in our Constitution is both a lawyer and also a politician. I do think it's important to keep the two separate. I note, for example, this Attorney General is effectively treated as a member of Cabinet. I don't think that's wise. I think the Attorney General should attend Cabinet only for those matters either.
It's interesting because a diplomat has said that UK foreign policy is being choked up by lawyers. It certainly seems to me, when you look at things such as the controversial deal over the Chagos Islands, when you now look at this sort of foot-dragging about supporting our greatest allies in an offensive against Iran, that it seems to me that it's definitely becoming a bit of a spanner in the works, a glitch in the system, slowing down what at times needs to be quite quick and decisive policy making.
I think it's actually more fundamental even than that. I think the real issue is this. There are some people who start from the proposition that law is the supreme virtue and questions are better decided by lawyers than by politicians. And I think there are a number of people in the government, I think the attorney is one, I think the Prime Minister is another, who quite like to redefine what are essentially political questions as legal questions. And then they say, oh, but you can't argue with our conclusions because this is all a matter of law. I take the view that political questions remain political questions and they have to be decided on the floor of the House of Commons and not in a court. And that is a fundamental distinction, I think, in the way that different people see the political world. Ultimately, these sorts of questions are intensely political. And I would suggest that the truth is that a lot of what is driving the government's response to the crisis in the Middle East is domestic political considerations and not so much legal considerations. And my concern is that sometimes they hide behind law in order to stop analysis, prevent analysis of their political decisions.
So essentially, I mean, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but this is about either pandering to the backbenchers or potentially shoring up support from elements of the Muslim community?
Well, that they were unlawful. Every time they're asked on an interview whether these strikes were unlawful, they say, well, the lawfulness is a matter for the Americans to justify. But we don't say that about other international issues. We don't say that the lawfulness of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a matter for the made earlier. I don't like the fact that the government often hide behind law and legality to cover up what are essentially political decisions.
I don't know what you make of this, but apparently now French President Emmanuel Macron has said the US-Israeli strikes on Iran were conducted outside of international law. The Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has decided to publicly slam the war as illegal, where Keir Starmer began raising the spectre of the legality or the legitimacy of the preemptive offensive strikes by Israel and America. It seems that other leaders in Europe are now
by acting prospectively if you're faced with an imminent attack. Now, how do you apply that to a nuclear threat? How real does a threat have to be before you can take steps to remove that threat? I had an online discussion with a leading international lawyer, and where he got to was that you have to be 51% against 49% satisfied that they were about to launch nuclear weapons. Well, if you're the leader of any country on earth, that's not the sort of gamble you're going to take. I think one of the issues is that international law has to cater for the world we live in. And we have to be real about the world we live in, about rogue states such as Iran, which frankly doesn't care a fig for international law, obtaining weapons which, once used, you can't put the nuclear bomb back in the box.
I'm just going to ask you a question. It's just come in from a viewer here, and it seems like a sort of silly, simple question. I'm not saying that to be offensive to you, Brian, who's messaging, because I actually think it's well worth asking, because it's something we keep talking about, international law, don't we? And he just says, who sets international law, and can we change it?
Brian's question is, if I may say, an absolutely fantastic question, because there are a number of sources of international law. And I don't want to turn your program into a seminar, but essentially international law comes from various sources. You have treaties between particular countries, you have conventions, which more countries sign up to, and you also have something called customary international law. In other words, the way states do things can both make and change international law. So Brian hits on a really important point. Part of international law involves looking at state practice, and custom and practice is part of international law. So I would suggest, if Brian isn't already signed up to a course on international law somewhere, he sounds like the sort of person who should, because he's hit on, if I may say, a really important point, that unlike domestic law, which is set really from two sources: one, parliamentary statutes, and two, court decisions. International law comprises treaties, conventions, decisions of international courts, but also customary international law, i.e. state practice. So it's a really good point he makes.
Yeah, no, it is one of those questions that you think, well, why has no one asked that? You kind of feel like an idiot asking it, but it is really important. So I'm going to ask you Alex's version of Brian's question is, well, what happens when you break international law? Because there's plenty of rogue states out there, from Russia to Iran, the list goes on, who seemingly don't give a fig about international law until it's in their interest to start saber-rattling at the UN about international law. So when you are a country that just goes, well, you know, that...
We hold before. So if, for example, you break a treaty which has a court supervising it, you can be hauled before that court, and the various international courts like that, you might law, and it goes back really to Brian's question, is because usually it's in everybody's interest to live in a world which is governed by rules and order rather than disorder. But of course, the problem comes when you're dealing with a state which, as you say, doesn't care about international law. And the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said yesterday that, of course, one of the problems in dealing with Iran, if you seek to abide by international law, is that he said it's like boxing with one arm tied behind your back. Maybe it's even boxing with both arms tied behind your back. And I think we do need to be clear-eyed about this. I mean, international law is there to make sure that we live in a world of order and rules. That's a good thing. But international law is not meant to be a suicide pact. We're not meant to roll over and have our strategic tummies tickled. And I think we do need to be realistic about that.
Is it fair to say, finally, that when it comes to the current state of play with international law and the supranational organisations that are the guardians of it, that there is a heck of a lot that is not fit for purpose anymore? For example, in the UN, the security...
that the democracies are not a majority when you look around the world. So when we next hear the UN General Assembly said this, that, or the other, we need to remember who's on it. So far as the Security Council is concerned, you're right. We've got Russia, who flagrantly breaches international law, and we've got China, which is a totalitarian communist state. And that's why I think we do need, as I said earlier, to be clear-eyed about this. International law is one thing. Morality is another. I think sometimes people confuse the two. I remember at the time of the Iraq war, two Church of England bishops wrote, I think, to the Times, saying that war would be immoral. That was the word they used, immoral, unless the United Nations Security Council had authorized it. Well, I fail to see how the vote of President Xi or President Putin makes something moral or not. So let's distinguish between international law and morality. So far as international law is concerned, we have historically been, and we should remain, a country which abides by international law. But we should be very careful before concluding that international law requires us to do things which, as I say, appear either internally inconsistent or strategically naive.
It's been a real privilege having you on, Lord Wolfson, the Shadow Attorney General there. Quick thoughts from you before we go to our next break.
Every military operation I've done, there has to be a legal statement to it. You either get two sets of lawyers who will say no, 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 and lawyers who will say, I can see what you're trying to do, and this is the way to do it. And under international law, your treaties and conventions tend to be black and white. They're laid out, there's details there, and you've signed up to them. But this customary international law that Lord Wolfson talked about is up to interpretation, and it's interpretation from the country that is interpreting it. So Macron can turn around and say, I believe it's wrong. Albanese can say, I believe you're breaking international law from a French or from an Australian perspective, but not from an American perspective, because the Americans do that. There's a lot of wiggle room in it.
And this is, can I just remind everybody, if Macron's got a bee in his bonnet about whether it's internationally lawful to take out the Ayatollah, I'm pretty sure it was France who took out Colonel Gaddafi.
Yes.
Sort of led the...
It's up to interpretation at the time. Up to interpretation,
but they were definitely well, we were as well, but they were definitely fairly and played a central role to that.
And the French have supported a few other things around the world that we don't really want to talk about in there because it might upset the French. Let's upset the French.
I love the French, but maybe not Macron. Okay, right, we're going to be